Anyway, moving on. From, I suppose, a story about demolishing something to nothing, we now literally have a story about nothing, and that is the history of zero, the concept of zero, the mathematical. Is zero an integer? If
Look,
it's not
I was out of my
positive?
comfort zone with porpoises, and well, I'm so out of my zone with higher mathematics. Don't ask.
I don't think this is higher. I think this is high school level. But this is the story of a manuscript that was discovered in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, by a farmer in what is now Pakistan. Obviously, the region has undergone certain geopolitical changes in the past 100 years or so. And eventually, this manuscript came to be at Oxford. It was in the Bodleian since 1902, and it was identified as being very, very special because it mentions and it explores and discusses, and it is an example of the use of zero in mathematics, which is something which is it's interesting if you look at the history of numbers, and especially the reason for increasingly complicated mathematics, especially in ancient history. It's clear that zero wasn't necessarily something that they were concerned about, because for the most part, especially with cuneiform and then in ancient Egypt, what they're doing is they're tracking stuff. They're tracking often for purposes of taxation or for trade, and you can't trade nothing. You can't, nothing isn't an important concept when it comes to that sort of stuff. But it is incredibly important when it comes to starting to become more abstract with your mathematics. When it comes to applying this stuff to spatial calculations and all this kind of malarkey. So when you get beyond counting what's in front of you and you actually start to think about essentially what's in front of you, zero is crucial. And the document was initially thought to be from around about the 9th century, so just over 1,000 years old. But they've carbon dated part of the document, and the date has been pushed back to somewhere between 224 and 383 AD, or rather AD 224 or 383. What do you, I don't know. You say you're outside your comfort zone with this, but I find it really interesting. But what do you think is the Do you think it matters? Do you think it matters that we have a sense of when zero came from?
Oh, of course it does. Because although I'm completely out of my comfort zone, this made me actually go back and read some of the background material on this, and actually, it's absolutely fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the fact that I think we need to make clear nobody's claiming that this document shows that zero was invented by the people in what is now Pakistan about 300 AD or whatever. No. It's the representation of zero as a number as we understand it today, and other cultures in other parts of the world and other periods of history have had a concept of zero, of nothing, that they've used in accounting. So just that in itself is fascinating. And it's obvious when you stop and think about it, because if you're the emperor's tax collector or the king of Akkad's tax collector, and the local farmers are presenting you with jars of beer as part of your taxation, the moment you're presented with 9 plus 1, you've got 10, and there's that kind of calculation, the decimal calculation, is very simple and easy. Lots of cultures have adopted it, but you need to represent 10 and 0 to show that it's 10, not just 1. You need a symbol or something to show that there's another digit there, so something even simply at that level, to think about something like that. The other thing I think I found again absolutely fascinating about it is that that sense of cultures developing at different times, at different rates, and in different places, all coming up with these ideas, which I think is a wonderful example of the going back to one of my favourite subjects, the ancient aliens theory. The Egyptians built these pyramids, and then the Mayans built these pyramids, so they must have learned how to do it from the Egyptians, like heck we did. People are really bright and really clever, and if they need to solve a problem, they'll solve it in their own right. They don't need to get somebody else to solve it for them, or look at what great-great-granddad did on the Nile Valley. It's a wonderful lesson in quite how clever people are. And the final thing I got from it, I think, is quite how crucial it is to us in our modern lives, because the moment I started thinking about it, I was thinking about it because we're going to be talking here on an electronic medium, but with not just an electronic medium, a digital electronic medium that depends on noughts and ones.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, 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 yes, exactly. And without something as simple as that sort of binary concept of a logic gate,
Mm,
none of this would be possible.
absolutely.
And so, yeah, in that sense, it is important to trace the number zero. But I think not only is it important possibly to trace it as it were, as a contributor to the way that we live today, but also I think it's important to trace it because it highlights it once again, as we were talking about earlier, in the earlier segment, that the past is a foreign country. And so when it comes to calculations, I mean, it's really actually now it's quite difficult to comprehend a system where you're adding up many millions of something, and yet there isn't a 1 6 zeros. Million has its own symbol,
Yes.
and that makes calculus and calculations so much more complicated because you've got to hold in your head what that symbol means and combine it with all with other elements which aren't essentially swap outable. The zero allows you to swap out all this stuff because it is essentially. I mean, initially it was just a placeholder, a dot, basically,
Yes.
but then it became a digit in its own right. That I think is fascinating. The fact that because obviously, well not obviously, but it is the case that the way that we teach maths is changing all the time. So, for example, at the moment in primary schools in the UK, it's very fashionable to teach maths in a way which has been adopted in I think in China for a while now. The way that they approach maths and shapes and the patterns in numbers. So obviously that's always changing, but this really highlights that mathematical conversations between people who are equally clever might take a bit of time across ages. In the same way, I guess it's the same way as language, isn't it? In the same way that it would take a bit of time to catch up and maybe actually talk to someone who's talking Old English. It would also take a bit of time for a mathematician to do the same.
I think it's also really important to remember, and you listen to people like Michael Satoy and Brian Cox and people who talk about mathematics and physics and symbols and stuff, that they're very keen to point out quite correctly that actually mathematics, physics is creative. It is, and in many ways, an equation can be beautiful in its simplicity and the way it uses those symbols. And the way it uses logic and uses a mathematical language rather than say the verbal language that we're using now. But it can be just as elegant, just as important, just as make just as fundamental a point about the human condition.
Yeah. Well, and it suggested that that there may well be, if there isn't other intelligent life elsewhere, they may well communicate using maths as opposed to what we describe as language. There's one more thing that I found really interesting from this story, though, was the fact that this page came as part of a book that was collected over the course of about 500 years. It seems that there are 500 years in terms of age difference between the oldest and the youngest pages within the book itself.
Yeah.
So I like the idea. I really like that idea that someone's been lovingly gathering together all this knowledge over the course of centuries. It's almost like a really well used textbook. And instead of having people writing "I love Wendy," what they've been doing is swapping out pages, and I guess that it's a wonderful. I don't know. It's just so. It gets me very excited.
But I think to extend the discussion very slightly from that particular starting point, I think we're starting to see this more and more as the and again I think it once more shows the importance of not just maintaining archives but revisiting them from time to time to ask new questions and apply new research techniques. Because that's how this came about. The new dating was part of a new research program on this, as you say, this object that's been known about for over a century now. But I think we've seen some again in the last few weeks. I think St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, the library there. Some new work there has identified some extinct languages that there is evidence for in the manuscripts that are held in their library, which date right back to I think the 5th century, 6th century. AD, around in that period immediately after the end of the Roman Empire, and so and these aren't actually pages of these particular languages, but they're pages that were erased to have new pages put, new words put on top. But the modern forensics can show what was underneath, what was what the scribes tried to eradicate before they put their new page down. Absolutely fascinating. And
and was it last month that someone revisiting remains in Morocco pushed back the age of humanity by 100,000 years? You know,
we talked
so
about that. Yes, absolutely.
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, exactly. Revisit your archives, people. Revisit your archives.
And maintain your archives. First of all, that's the problem we've got at the moment.
Oh yes, well yes, indeed, funding. Yeah, no, I really like that. I really like that story.